way to play with the decorative stitches on the Baby Lock Joy is applique. In this case, what I've done is I've fused a piece of fabric to my base fabric. And I always like to play with circles when I'm testing stitches because I think they're easier to maneuver around the edges with your stitches. One of the most common stitches that you'll see that a lot of people use for applique is actually just a standard zigzag. So I'm going to turn my stitch selector to that C setting. Now what comes into play is going to be the width and the length. Let's leave the width at 5 and let's take our length to 2. I don't want a satin stitch. I just want something that's a little bit more open, a little bit more fun, as I like to say, a little bit more contemporary. So what's going to happen is, as you can see, the needle is swinging left and right, and the needle is just kind of going off that edge of that fabric, and most of my stitching is actually going to be on my base fabric, or actually, excuse me, my circle. And if I spread it out so that half of my stitch is on my base and half of the stitch is on my circle, I get a completely different look. The next stitch that I like to play with is actually stitch number E. It looks similar to what I would call a faux blanket stitch. It's not going to quite be a blanket stitch, but it's pretty close. So we're going to take our needle out of the fabric because we are adjusting our stitch selector, and that will move the needle position, and you don't want that needle position to actually move inside your fabric. So we're going to make sure that we're on E, and then again I'm going to stay at that 5 setting for my width. In this case, I'm actually going to shorten my stitch length down, and I'm going to start with the a setting of 1. Now for this stitch, if we take a look at it, those tiny little zigzags, we actually want those along that outside edge of our circle, and those peaks that we see on that stitch, we actually want those to jump into our circle. So this one does take a little bit of time sometimes to get the whole positioning of your fabric down. Now I think 1 is a little long for this particular stitch, so I'm actually going to shorten it a little bit past that 1 and see how that affects. And what that does is it puts those tiny little zigzags a little closer together so they almost mimic a straight stitch, and it puts that peak a little closer together so it almost mimics that blanket stitch. Now when I've got that set, I always make little notes on my fabric pieces as to what my settings are. Now the last one that I like to play with is actually one of my favorite stitches. It's the Rickrack Stitch. And again, you're going to want to take your needle out of the fabric when anytime you make an adjustment to that stitch style, especially with stitches that move to the left or the right, so that you ensure that your needle doesn't get caught in that fabric. So now I'm on the letter C, but if I take a look at my graphic, it shows the stitch in red, which tells me I need to go to my stretch stitch setting. And again, when I'm at this setting, I'm still going to leave that width at 5. And what happens with this stitch is it's a zigzag, but it goes over each leg of that zigzag several times, so it's a little heavier. And by changing to a heavier decorative thread, the look that you get with this stitch is actually what I consider very stunning. Again, it's one of my favorite stitches and can be used in a lot of different applications. And we'll just stitch around this one. Again, you can choose to have that peak right along the edge, or you can straddle the stitch along that raw edge. And I'm coming up to the end of my piece, and we'll take a big reveal or take a look at all of the stitches that we've stitched out. The needle is going to come out of that fabric, raise that presser foot, use the thread cutter, and let's take a look at our stitches. This is our standard zigzag. Here we cut that needle real close to the edge, and then here we floated off, so our thread floated off of that fabric. And this is where I might use a heavier decorative thread for that look. And as I come around my circle, here is stitch number E, which is that a blind hem stitch. And you can see how I adjusted that stitch as I got closer to the end here. This looks very close to a blanket stitch right in here, with those peaks getting closer together, meaning there isn't as much space in between the left and right side of that peak. And then my favorite stitch, which is the Rickrack Stitch, again along the edge, and then here I straddled it. As you can see, the Baby Lock Joy gives you a lot of great options, whether it's applique or just decorative stitching along a fabric edge.